if you think that you've come here to listen to me telling you how to use AI for storytelling, think again. I'll mention AI twice. It's storytelling in the age of AI, right? Okay, but let me start with the elephant in the room. The new kid on the block has arrived, and it ain't going nowhere, right? We can agree on that. And no matter how many guardrails we put there so that we can't use it, or the studios can't use it for storytelling or whatnot, just consider this thing has come to a capitalist, profit-driven system. Nobody's stopping. Whatever can make it more cheap, faster, and more convenient to create content. So, I don't want to be naive about it. I hope you're not either. The first time I used an AI was on really the eve of its launch, and I happened to be here in Göteborg visiting a friend who is an AI lecturer academic lecturer. And like me, she grew up as a refugee, and like me, she was a linguist. So we got talking about words, and we said, what's the difference between a refugee and a migrant? There is this new thing, migrant. So we go to ChatGPT, define the difference. And it beautifully defines the difference. And then we just looked at each other and we go, tell us a joke about migrants. And it goes, migration is not something to joke about. Millions of people are dislocated from their home, yada, yada, yada. Politically correct immediately. And we go, wait, we are migrants and we like joking about it. So go ahead and tell us a joke. And it goes, okay, how does a migrant take their coffee? To go. Then and there I knew we were in serious trouble. So I've been playing with it a lot. And if you have never gotten anything brilliant out of it, trust me, you haven't been trying. It can do brilliant things, and it can do a lot of mediocre things. Now, usually the thing we use to tell ourselves that really it's not a big deal, it cannot compete with us, is it's not alive, it's not really creative as us, it's not alive. But let me remind you of an old quote by Oscar Wilde. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist, that is all. How alive are we, really? This is what I want to explore. I don't want to explore AI with you today, I want to explore us. So, what is the most common type of story out there that you encounter on a daily basis? It's just everywhere. Well, it has a proper scientific name. Nyeh. That's like somebody asked, what do you think about this? Nyeh. It's neither here nor there. It has all the moving parts in the right place, but it just lacks originality, vibrancy. It's generic, unoriginal, repetitive. You've seen it everywhere. That's the vast majority of everything, and this is not being mean. I sit in a number of committees in Europe, and somebody on stage said today, Katja, it's 90%, right, is mediocre content. No. To be honest, it's 98. Now, average, mediocre is completely fine. It's normal. Most of the stuff we do in our lives is average. From time to time, we are brilliant. Most of the time, we are not. But now we have technology that can do premium mediocre quickly, cheaply. This is the issue. Mediocre is not an issue. Average is not an issue. So the first time I got my eyes opened for mediocre output from talented, experienced writers, I really got interested to why was this happening. So on one of the first projects I worked on, the producer got really frustrated with her writer. He was just leveling out for a whole year. Nothing was getting better despite a year of development. And he had a CV like my leg. He was really experienced and successful. So I asked her, what do you think the problem is here? And she said, oh, fuck, you know what? The guy has just 2 brain cells in his head and they are fighting with each other. And you know what else? He's jaded. And what did I know? I mean, maybe he was stupid. But then a week later, I get an opportunity to sit with the man and discuss his project. And not only was he intelligent, he was very intelligent. He was educated, and he did a lot of research about the project he was writing on. So he knew a lot about what he was writing on. Or rather, he thought he knew a lot what he was writing about. So somewhere along the way, he lost his capacity, his ability. He forgot how to see the chicken. Now, what does this mean? I have two twins in my family, my niece and nephew. We call them the turbo twins. And it explains everything. And now they are 8 years old, but when they were 4 years old, they had this obsession with chicken. And you can see it in children all the time. You would take them to a chicken coop in a park, and they just stop. The turbo twins that never stop. And they focus, and they relate to each specific chicken as if it was the only thing existing on the planet. The communication and the communion was divine. The presence was unbelievable. That's what the children are capable of. But how long does it last? Right? As children, they speak already 4 languages. When I took them 6 months later to the same chicken coop, I expect the same obsession to continue. And what happens? I go like, look, you're chickens. And they go like, yeah, okay. It's like, but look, they're big now. And my niece goes, it's a chicken. Have you seen that eye roll for the first time in a girl? It's brutal. So what happened in her mind, the word, the concept took place of the lived experience. Reality got boiled down to concept. Now, that's not a problem. That's how humans develop. We use language to orient ourselves in reality. But sorry is the artist who's lost the ability to see the chicken. They see a lot of A chickens. Grammatically incorrect, but true. Now, let's consider for a moment what's necessary to create good art. I love this equation. I've created over 16 hours of lectures just exploring this. It's fascinating. What is art? What is fire? What is algebra? Well, art in the context of TV series, for me, it's a kind of series or a story that points you back to life. Instead of hooking you to the screen so that you wane and wither watching stuff, it has so much substance and vibrancy that you are reminded back to life. And you can, okay, and before I watch next episode, I'm going to reflect, I'm going to re-engage with my own lived reality. That's art. Very few series are of that caliber. It's rare. Algebra is craft, is understanding the internal logic of a story, knowing how to deal with structure and stuff like that. It has to be learned. It's the craft that needs to be developed over time. AI kicks ass with this already. Just to be honest, it does. It gets the structure perfectly. Now, what's the fire? It's not just inspiration and passion, although it applies. I'm talking of a different type of fire. They say that the children and mystics have fire in their eyes because they have eyes that burn through illusions. What are illusions? Concepts, words are not reality. They burn through it. Cultural programming, programming from the family, any type of conditioning that we acquire through life, the eyes that can burn through it see life anew, like children, right? So in filmmaking terms, this would mean they have eyes that are cameras with clear lenses instead of projectors. And most of us, most of the time, carry projectors in our heads. Does it make sense? Are you with me? Mm-hmm. How easy is it to have fire in your eyes today? It's terribly difficult. From morning until we go to bed, we are exposed to stories. Now, this picture shows only narratives from our own industry, right? But from, the littlest tweet to the Nobel Prize-winning novel is a narrative. Everything we move in our daily lives is a conceptualized electronic digital version of reality. It's everywhere. Previous generations didn't have that problem. We are suffocating in stories. We are absolutely drowning. Now, the way we consume stories, I think, is more akin to this. This picture shows you somebody gulping on junk food, but this is not the point. Is it junk food or is it quality food? It's just the quantity of it. So even if you have the most sensitive palate in your eyes, in your mouth, you can really taste beautiful wine beautifully, and you drink a liter of it every day. Does it make you a connoisseur or an alcoholic? And we are definitely storyholics. This messes up the creative capacity unbelievably. Most storytellers of our time live in worlds like this, completely locked in minds of concepts on previously imprinted narratives. So working in development, to me, is like constantly being exposed to predictable patterns. I've come to a point when I can predict lines of dialogue with such accuracy that it scares me when I read scripts. Also, when I'm in a room with people, it's predictable how we think. Sometimes I think, geez, am I becoming a witch? But then I realize, no, it's not me at all. It's the time we live in. We are bombarded and bombarded and bombarded. It penetrates us to a degree that is unprecedented. Now, because of this, most stories out there are paler and paler echoes of strong stories. So from once in a while, every time, a strong story, like a very bloody story in the sense of vibrancy and life that it carries. It's close to lived experience, right? And it mesmerizes everybody. And then years later, the market is flooded with the shades of pale. Now, the tricky thing about this is nobody involved in the development process creatively can tell the difference. You can have an amazing development process while creating a pretty generic story. That's what confuses me a lot of the time. So there's no knowing what's going to happen until the very end. Now, derivative storytelling, we all recognize it. It's like the majority of it. But what worries me is when I notice that it's not just derivative in the way the plot is constructed or the concepts I've seen before, it's the perceptions of reality. What the story is showing us about life, that's derivative. The narrow sense of reality is usually the problem here. So everything is derivative. Essentially, the problem with mediocre stories that AI can really compete with us on, is that we are dealing with stories about stories. They're not stories about life. And I'm not talking about realism and biographical accuracy or anything like. I'm talking stories close to lived experience. Most stories are very far removed from it. And both humans and AI are creating this. That's why I don't think we should be arrogant about our creativity, but really stop and think where we are failing so that we can get our muscles stronger and then engage with AI or not, right? Just to give you a couple of examples. One of the most beloved films of all time. 20 years later, I watch it religiously every year. I know it by heart, but I love it. And then this comes out. The most expensive series ever made. $1 billion. When I heard that, immediately my response was shame. Shame for working in this industry. Like, how many hungry people can we feed with $1 billion? Right? It's insane amount of money, and then this is what comes out of it. I talked to a friend's son, the same friend that was talking to AI at the beginning. She has a 19-year-old son, one of the best film critics I've ever encountered, brilliant guy. I said, what did you think about this? And he said it was an insult to my intelligence and my heart. Now, it's obviously copying the world, and that's not the level of content copying that I'm talking about. Why is this an echo of something very vibrant? You know, Tolkien learned about war, hardship and friendship and loyalty in the trenches of the First World War. He lived a very intense life. The guys who wrote this, well, my assessment is that they for sure watched a lot of television. Now, another typical echo. When these two came, wow, right? What's happening now? How many versions of a man descending into darkness, morally corrupt? Have you seen a man, a woman, a child, whatever? Gazillion. Czech version, Australian version, gazillion American versions. Succession. I hate it. For many reasons, it really bothered me when it came, but it's brilliantly written. These two are really great algebra. You can't complain, they are really well told. Again, I had to go talk to my friend's son and said, what did you think about Succession? And this is even better. He goes, a bunch of emotionally stunted assholes stabbing each other in the back. Am I supposed to be impressed? I'd rather watch somebody watering their plants on TikTok if they're honest about it. From the mouth of babes, as they say. What's the problem here if not the craft? Craft, brilliant storytelling. This shows, to me, a problematic at the level of worldview and the life philosophy. They're deeply cynical. I used to love Breaking Bad. I wouldn't watch it again for the life of me. This is a deeply cynical worldview. And what they also do really well is diagnose the illness of our society. They are like doctors that you go to tell you what's wrong with you. And then you go, and you say, why do you look at me? I have nothing more to share. Go away. There is no cure in sight. There is just the diagnosis of the disease. And this is the prevalent storytelling on our screens. This is what bothers me deeply, because it affects us energetically, and emotionally, spiritually. This kind of storytelling penetrates our hearts, and there is no cure mentioned for whatever ailment they show. So if we want to be fresh and new in our storytelling in the age of AI, we somehow have to go to more original places than just copying something unconsciously a lot of the time. So nobody's doing this on purpose. We are all swimming in the same soup. The writers, the audience, the developers, we are all over consuming stories. So everybody looks for something original. I think it's worth remembering what original comes from. Original is related to origin. Origin means source. So what is the source of a good story? Is it a bunch of other stories? Or is it something else? I live in Stockholm, and a friend of mine, Swedish friend, calls me one day and says, you know that I sing in a choir? I said, sure. I said, well, our choir leader chose this old Serbian song for us to sing. I said, which one? And it turns out to be a song called Ajde Jano, or Come Jana. Jana is a girl's name. Come Jana, come. I said, I know that one, so let me find original versions for you. So I find them on Spotify. And I re-listened to the song that I've heard over 100 times in my life, and I hear it properly for the first time. You know how it happened? Like, dsh. Suddenly you hear what it's saying, and it just shook the ground under my feet. It goes like this, the first verse. Come Jana, come my soul, let's dance kolo, which is this type of traditional dance. So far, nothing real, right? The second verse goes, come Jana, let's sell our horse. My soul, let's sell our horse just so we can dance. This type of dance. And the third verse goes, come Jana, please, let's sell our house just so we can dance. Kolo. And my head, well, what the fuck? Why would you sell everything you have in order to dance? Because this wasn't cool when I was growing up, traditional. And as soon as I asked myself that, I was stricken by lightning, by a memory so vivid that it could have happened yesterday, and I haven't thought about it in over 30 years. Direct, vibrant, lived experience. I grew up in former Yugoslavia. My very educated, well-traveled parents were born in two small villages like this in Herzegovina. If you have been to Montenegro, Greece, this kind of, place. They had electricity, my grandparents, but no running water. It was rough and rural, and not a gentle life. Now, I would spend my summers there, and I've lived more during those summers than under the 20 years of my life in Scandinavia. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. Life was alive, not because I was a child, because life was in your face. So they would dance on weddings and, several times a year. They would go into these kolo dances. And what I remember was a night. So usually on a wedding, they would start dancing in the morning. It's pretty nice, celebratory, laugh, love, life, la la. But as the night falls down and the moon comes up, the energy changes. And by the end of it, the women are left. And they turn into these wild witches. I asked ChatGPT to show it. Look at their faces. It's not that different from what I remember. They put me in the center of one of those rings. And I'm surrounded, first of all, I'm surrounded by huge breasts. This is the only thing in line of my vision. Can you imagine that old women with bras that were loose and the breasts that go And I'm like, wherever I look, there's just physicality of those breasts. And I remember being in the middle of that call and thinking, please God, or whoever else is out there, while I was doing this, never let me grow big breasts. And I got my wish fulfilled. But the second thing, these dances are pretty elaborate. But as the night went, the steps become more simple, more repetitive, more primal. And it all turns into a wonderful, ecstatic, shared experience. And what happens when people dance for hours and hours and hours together? Well, the energy that comes out of them, you can cut it with a knife. The aliveness, you wouldn't believe. But also something not just coming from them, something comes to them. Something else was there, a life itself. This was not normal state of consciousness. We all got expanded, and I lived in that as a kid. I witnessed it so many times. I come from a place where war is ever present. Every generation, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, had people in their family brutally killed. Like the history of our family, you wouldn't believe. A lot of time in front of others. Some are, killings. There were pits with snakes where people were thrown in front of family members, wounded, and then left there to die with the snakes coming at them. 3 generations experienced this. And yet, they were able to celebrate life like there was no tomorrow. None of my ancestors, and let's honor people for this. My grandparents were over 100 years old, and their peers. None of them had cancer, none of them had dementia. I don't think they knew what depression was. They were not depressed, they were not suppressed, they were not repressed, right? What did they do? How did they get away from that trauma? They were traumatized for sure, but how were they able to be so alive? Now, another thing to mention, from that little place, that little area of rural life where most people didn't have more than 4 years of primary school education, the next generation had incredibly successful businessmen, academics, poets, philosophers. Every house had people at such a high level of achievement. My parents' generation, you wouldn't believe the crispiness of this area, mental crispiness, is unlike anything I've met anywhere else. And I travel all the time. So something was happening energetically, clearing people's minds and souls. Now let me take you to the opposite side of it. Do you know what this is? If you've grown up in a Protestant culture, you probably never encountered it. This is ChatGPT generated, obviously, but it's the way people were dealing with death and funerals. Have you ever heard of wailing, keening, gråterskur? The experience of that, to be there when it's happening, it takes your skin off. Everything is felt. And you're not just grieving the person who died. When they start crying, everything that was hurt in us gets expressed. And when I remembered all of this, I remembered, oh my God, these were psychological methods of healing. This is all pagan wisdom that survived Christianity and what is still left there in fragments. Why am I talking about this in context of storytelling? This kind of a capacity that my grandparents had and many people I knew from that area to hold contradictions emotionally, cognitively, extremes of darkness and light, is what every artist should be able to do. But it's not really true for people living in the modern Western reality. It's really not. Very rarely do I meet people who have that capacity to hold it without succumbing to it, because we live in a world that doesn't allow us to feel that much. Now, modern people are much more familiar with this. I'm stranger and afraid in the world I never made. The sense of disconnect and isolation is much more familiar to us. Now, this was from a poem from Alfred Hausmann, but you know Stranger, you read it in high school, I'm sure. Now, when I read it in high school, I loved discussing literature with my professor there, but the day we read Stranger, I was on my way to school fuming. I couldn't wait to get there to cut her head off. You know, he's a brilliant writer. I still love his writing, but you know what it shows, the kind of philosophy of life, the kind of perception of life? Well, I have 2 degrees in literature. I can tell you very expertly what it does, what it says. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's the essence of it. So it's deeply cynical. It's deeply cold and dissociated. Now, the writing is impeccable. He won a freaking Nobel Prize for a good reason. The writing is impeccable. But I remember saying to my teacher, like, I don't care how good his technique is. How can he paint life if he's colorblind? He didn't see so much. His perception was, not that it was wrong what he was showing, there was so much on the margins that he just didn't pick up on. Because he lived in a world that didn't help him with that. So stories can be really looked at from different levels. So writing, the craft, the algebra is the quality of expression. How good is somebody expressing something about life? And many people can be brilliant at that. But how good is the quality of their perception? How deep into reality do they actually see? How wide are their perceptions? And what kind of life philosophy are they selling through their story? Great writers are really convincing. Writing is emotional manipulation, if anything else. And Camus, he said, if I remember correctly, a novel is nothing if not a philosophy put into images. And in a good novel, images melt into story. Philosophy melts into story. So you don't perceive what the story is telling you. You're just hooked into the plot. So we have a whole lot of issues. If we want to tell something new, fresh, and original with the kind of stuff we are exposed to daily, it's very hard to clean the glasses. And yet, getting back to that chicken is the absolute necessity for an artist, right? And a lot of the time when I consult, especially when I work with people who are really good at the craft, so they don't need help with that, I end up doing this, cleaning glasses. And then in my own private life, I need my friends to clean my glasses because nobody can do it for themselves really well. We need to help each other with that, right? Another problem that we humans have, not AI, I would say, is layers and layers and layers of protection from actually feeling the deepest nuances of life and really extreme feelings. I say, compare the funerals I told you about with funerals that are pretty common here, when you keep somebody in a fridge for months, and then finally, family gets around to bury them in a very polite way. We read poetry and all of that. And it's beautiful, I'm not dissing that at all. It has such value and beauty to contemplate death, but there is nothing polite about dying. When in this culture are we allowed to howl, to feel and howl and just feel that life has ripped us apart? Almost never. And it creates a lot of layers of protection. So this is a problem as well. Now, I have a good friend, a Swiss friend. I studied with her in Finland, Nordic literature, and she speaks fluent Swedish, and she really loved Swedish literature. And this was way back, over 25 years ago. And I asked her, have you ever considered moving to Sweden? And she's from Switzerland. Pay attention. Have you ever considered moving to Sweden? And she said, no, I couldn't. Sweden is way too pasteurized. Pasteuriserad. And she wasn't mean about it. It wasn't meant in a mean way. But the funny is the Swiss person says this about Sweden, which is like, is Switzerland better? No, it's not. And I find that this word applies to most of the world now. So I think Sweden is probably the most intensely pasteurized. In a sense, safety, predictability, control are religious forces here. But I think it applies to most of modern life, right? That numbness that comes from hiding from the rawness of life. So when I started thinking about these things, you know how it is when you focus on something, suddenly life provides you with an opportunity to experience some of it? And I didn't count on this. So recently, and normally every year I would go for a month or two of silent retreat. somewhere off in the world and just switch off completely from any type of internet or anything and just sit in meditation or whatever. But this year my friends were like, why don't you try this 1 week retreat? And I'm like, 1 week, what's that? It's nothing, right? And it's a very intense retreat. It has a really strong reputation to be one of the most well put together processes that people go through. I'm like, okay, let me try it. And what I've experienced there in 1 week, and this retreat is a process that evolved over 40 years, therapists who kind of tested things to get people to strip that suit, to get people to feel everything that's inside them and guide them in a safe way. So not just get them open and leave them, but kind of guide them through it. So it's a combination of group therapy methodology and spiritual meditation practice that were very embodied. They go through the body, not just speaking about stuff, not just sitting silently, but everything you feel, you move. And I've never seen anything like it in my life. People who came there, none of them, they screened people with mental problems, so nobody had any big issues. Nobody was suicidal, nobody was severely depressed. They were just normal people. You could go to work with them, they are your family, you would, They lost 10 years of their life after 1 week going through that. And I won't give you details because I'm not plugging it. I just say that what I found there is suddenly stuff from my childhood. This kind of old wisdom is coming back in new form. People understand we need to release, we need to feel, we need to connect, we need communal healing. This self-obsessive individualistic healing is not enough. So obviously it's popping up in life. And to me that was interesting, but the sad thing is that we have to go to a retreat once a year or once every 5 years. It's not integrated in our lives. So this is where we are now. Okay, so back to stories. What to do, right? Nobody wants to write it, but it happens a lot of time. So most of the time I think people think that the remedy is going for the most realistic rendering of life. So let's focus on the mundane details of reality. Be really authentic in every detail. A lot of noir shows are doing that. Doesn't really make them true to life. Realistic and true to life are two different things. I like to say that there are episodes of Star Trek, The Next Generations, that are more true to life than many modern shows. They are not realistic, but they are true to life. They are deeply investigating the human condition. All right, I want to tell you a little bit what I mean. So if I show you a few pictures, do you recognize the situation from the news? This was Afghanistan, quite recently, Kabul airport. And when this happened, so many of us who went through very similar things got triggered, because we remember, this is on the very last day when it was possible, this is how I fled with my mom and my sister from Sarajevo when I was born in Bosnia. Now, if you only want to, say you want to tell a story about war and becoming a refugee, and all you have to go on is news, you've watched a lot of news, what would you know about this situation? Well, predictable stuff. It's chaotic, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, people behaving irrationally, they move like cattle in hordes, There's a lot of confusion, none of it is wrong. However, if you're not close to the lived experience of intense crisis, if you've never been around it, or if you have never had deep conversations with people who've had these experiences, you've missed on the beautiful, unpredictable things that happen. You've missed the chicken completely. All right? So I just want to give you one example of that. I got separated from my mom, my sister. It was total chaos. They separated men from women, obviously, but of course, some men wanted to flee anyway. So in this type of situation, I see my little sister far away, just squeezed between two fat men, one man's belly, another man's back. And they are so out of their mind that they don't see they have a child in between them, fainted. And I scream, "You're killing my sister." Nobody gives a damn. Nobody hears it, nobody notices. The people are out of their minds with stress because we had sniper fire at the same time. So the situation was beyond insane. And then suddenly, in the middle of that, a hand with an umbrella pops up. And a woman just opens and closes the big red umbrella out of nowhere. And because it's such a weird thing, everybody like, what the fuck, you know? She opens and closes. And then she leaves the open umbrella and goes, peace, calm down. We are better than this. We are better than this. We are better than this. That woman is the biggest inspiration of my life. Then and there. She had incredible presence, and she commanded presence, and people felt it, and suddenly all that insanity calmed down, and from that point when she was standing, just different energy started moving through people, and people suddenly woke up from the absolute chaos of their minds. Where there was no space, there was space. When there was no water, suddenly there was water. The man picked up my sister. You know, situation changed drastically. And that day, those 24 hours, because it was an agony, it took 24 hours to leave, it was full of these types of reversals of energy. Life was drastically dancing for us. And it does sometimes that, when the situation is intense. Sometimes these dance movements take years to unfold. You know, there are many different rhythms, but this was intense rhythm. Now, does this mean that if you as a writer, creative person, have not lived through really intense situations like this, you have nothing to write about? I don't think so at all. And I want to introduce you to the Swedish laundry room. Those of you who are not Swede, just let me explain that this is the one place where the most conflict-avoidant nation on the planet goes to war. This is what every building has a laundry room. I love my laundry room. It's incredible how much laundry you can do in 4 hours. Like, it's a luxury. But the neighbors' passive aggressiveness and conflict, the shapes it takes, you go like, creativity of it. So you don't need a large-scale war. You just pay attention to the human condition with the eyes that see the chicken. And you'll have stuff to write about. So the whole point is to become really sensitive to this dance of light and dark and hold it without judgment. Love the darkness as well, even when it ravages you, because it is the part of the human condition. So tired eyes, tired life, tired stories, eyes with a fire in them, wow. Who knows what you're going to see out there that you can tell a story about? So let's go back for a moment to the new Keynote block. I think what's rarely mentioned in discussions about AI is the metaphysics of working with AI. So I just want to step a little deeper with this. AI is the most suggestive technology ever made. And it's barely mentioned. So what does this mean? This is a technology that will always suggest you something. Whether you ask it or not, it will become integrated in practically everything we use, any type of device, any type of app. It will be giving you suggestions. And one of the first deep interviews I listened to with one of the software engineers from Silicon Valley that was questioning his life and work when he realized this. He said, I'm so afraid that there will be no more unassisted thinking left. We will become so used to being aided. We are already getting there, but there will be so many convenient, easier ways for us to think. And the AI is not thinking from a fresh place. Do you know this? No unassisted thinking. It has deep implications. I don't think we understand how this will affect the society. So when I was a teenager living in Belgrade, in Serbia at that time as a refugee, so nobody had any money. You know, it was really wild, wild east. But I had one friend from high school. Her parents had a lot of money because her dad was doing shady business. And both of her parents were engineers, but her mom didn't need to work, so she didn't. And she was bored out of her mind. And she would tell us about her new discoveries all the time, what she was doing to entertain herself. So one day she came to lunch and she said, "Oh, I have to tell you about this. There are these exercise tables." Exercise tables? I'm thinking, did you hurt yourself? Do you need rehabilitation? She said, "No, this is for healthy people. You get exercised. You lay down and you don't have to do anything. You get exercised." This is the essence of unassisted thinking. Please understand what this means. Now, this is crude technology. It's easy to understand why this is ridiculous. We understand that our bodies want something else. But AI is incredibly seductive, and it will adapt to us and our deepest desires. So I don't think it will be easy to dismiss it the way it's easy to dismiss these tables. So I just want to put it out there. No unassisted thinking. Another thing I want to point at is that AI treats reality like language. What does this mean? Now, we all know, we use language all the time, but we know that we cannot capture the fullness of reality in language. We know we cannot express the fullness of our experience in language. We try. If it were possible, poets wouldn't be the most tortured people on the planet. It's difficult, right? What language does is cut reality into fragments, and different languages cut reality differently. And all multilingual people know this. Languages are not synonymous, right? You cannot translate things fully. There are holes in language, and in these holes you become aware that language is not covering reality. But AI has only fragments to feed it and fragments to put out. So the tokens it's working with are fragments of language or other type of input it gets. So it's not weird that it treats text as language. It breaks text into pieces and reworks them. But it does that with sound, with image, with this type of the fMRIs, Wi-Fi, radio signals. It treats everything as fragmentary material. So we will be getting suggestions from something that has never had a holistic, embodied experience of life. And that has profound consequences. Now, one of the first novels that were written with ChatGPT, it was ChatGPT 3, and Pharmaco AI is the novel. And I listened to a long interview with the writer, and they said, like, what was your experience? It took good 2 years to finish that novel. And it's a good thing, you know, the prose text. It didn't happen quickly. It took 2 years. And they said, experience of working, collaborating with ChatGPT was like riding a racehorse through a field of concepts. There's a poetry to it, right? Riding a racehorse through a field of concepts. It goes quickly, it's seductive, you have to pull back to really embody the exchange you've had with it. He took his time, but our industry is not going to allow for a lot of time because, you know, cheap turnaround, quick turnaround. We are in TV industry. This was a person who did this as a side project, so they gave themselves 2 years. So riding a racehorse through a field of concepts, and concept can be images, it can be video, it can be text, it can be whatever, again pulls us back into this state where we are completely like locked into this, thinking the same thoughts more or less. It's really difficult. How do we wake up from this? Like, what could help is what I often ask myself. And I talk about these things because I have long periods when I experience this kind of shutting down, numbness, not so much emotionally, but I track my own coming to life, coming away from life, coming to life. So I'm not talking about other people as much as I know how this feels. I get locked into this because I'm highly intellectual as a person. And it's disease. I have to train myself to kind of let go of the mind. Okay, to give you an idea of what I'm pointing out, years ago, I listened to a lecture at Harvard by a Chinese psychology professor who spent good 2 hours just discussing the differences between these two kanji signs. And I wish I recorded the lecture. I just have memories of it, fragments. But what I remembered, what stayed with me, is that there is a great similarity, right? Half of it is the same between the sign for story and the sign for enlightenment. And what's the difference? The other part has to do with like I see, I speak through words. I speak with words, I tell words. That's a story. Story is telling something with words. Enlightenment is I speak with heart. I see through heart. And it's amazing, like, what is the difference between seeing through words and seeing through heart? How does it feel? What are they talking about here? And again, when I ask myself this question, immediately memories start flooding and kind of guiding me. To tell you really about what this can be, I have to go back to the village. Might be the same summer or the next summer. So the whole village goes to the fields. Nobody's left. And my grandparents asked me, you want to come with us? We'll be working on tobacco and corn. I'm like, no, I'm going to stay in the house and read, which is what I did most of the time. I just read books. I was 8 years old. And it was a hot summer day, up almost to 40 degrees, sizzlingly hot. And after a couple of hours, I get bored, like, okay, I'm gonna go to them. So I start walking through the empty village, like this. And after a few minutes, I just feel somebody's behind me. And I turn around, and I get a close encounter with this lovely or similar individual. My grandparents' psychotic cow, Zekulja was her name, and she had a reputation as a killer or wannabe killer. She was attacking everything and everyone, adult and child alike, animals, everybody except my tiny little grandmother. Go figure that. So she gives chase. She's bent on murder, and I start running through the woods. There's nowhere to hide, and I scream, "Help! Pomagajte!" Nobody is there to help me, and I find my refuge in this lovely establishment, but one that is much worse than this one. This is like Hotel Ritz. The one I ended up, this was just on the side of the road, a hole in the ground and a pile of steaming hot shit, because it was a hot day coming up almost. And I closed the door, and then I realized it smells awfully. And the flies. You wouldn't believe the stench of it. And all I can do is do this, make sure that she doesn't go through the door, and she bangs the door with her horns. After a while, I think, well, she might have left. Every time I wanted to leave, and I realized there's nothing to do. Then wait, I knew it eventually. Somebody might come and save me. So what happens when we finally accept a situation that's deeply uncomfortable? Doesn't happen all the time, but this was my first experience of something pretty amazing. So I only did this, and after a while there's nothing happening. I can hear her breathing. I can hear myself, smelling everything. And at one sudden moment, I drop into it. Not in the hole with the shit, but into my own stomach. Into a very specific place in my stomach, which I later learned about what it was that I experienced. Like 3 fingers under your belly button is a place called Lower Dantian in Tibetan meditation tradition. And there are techniques to focus. When you focus on that specific place, eventually, if you're lucky, suddenly you drop into a state of total awareness. And like your stomach opens up, the whole world opens up. And there is no words that can explain this. Now, people who had these experiences, they know that whatever I say is ridiculous. People who haven't had ever these experiences, maybe had it as a child, but they forgot about it. Whatever I say makes no sense. So damned if I do, damned if I don't, right? But I have clear memory of such aliveness and vibrancy. I was still aware of the smell, the buzzing of the flies, the cow was there, but there was no difference between me and the flies, or me and the cow. Everything was beautifully as it should be. Everything was placed exactly as it should be. There was nothing wrong with that situation. The ultimate, everything is okay. This is what meditation can kind of get you to. And you can hold a deeply uncomfortable situation because you're in a space that is much bigger than it. This kind of experience I later understood is called non-dual awareness. It has a name. I just called it, because it happened in different occasions in my childhood, I called it melting with the wind. When you become everything. without losing your sense of self. You're still there, but you become one with the world. For the purposes of our exploration, I call this the unstoried space, because there are no narratives that can capture it. It's bigger than any story about reality that we can tell. Now, it's so important, I find, for today's, our time artists to have access to this. Because if we don't, all we have is the noise in our heads, and our heads are pretty noisy with pre-programmed narratives. So this kind of mental opening, and then you come back to normal mundane perception of reality, but from time to time you will get open. And it happens when you're in the nature. You can go hiking and experience it. Meditation, for sure. There are many, many things. Ecstatic dances that my grandparents did, that also leads to that. Sexuality can lead to that. Taking plant medicine, I mean, you name it, you can just find your own thing. But there needs to be some way toward it, because otherwise we are constantly in the noise. Everybody wants to be outside-the-box thinker, right? Everybody wants to. The perfect writer would be the outside-the-box original writer, but this capacity is not a function of intellect. It's about getting beyond the intellect. And I'm talking about these altered, expanded states of consciousness, because there is inspiration. There is newness. That is not pre-programmed. It is a space of potentiality and newness. Now, fresh perceptions, dropping the intellect, is very important from time to time. And a good example of that, I find, is this woman, also a country woman from Yugoslavia. One of the most original artists of all time, probably, right? Marina Abramović was a grandmother of performance art. You could never predict what she would do, except that it would be edgy. You know, she surprised everybody and herself constantly. But she lived a life of constant getting into that space. You know, she gave her life to learning how to do that, through overcoming physical pain, through meditative techniques, whatnot. And she was the athletic, champion of that capacity. Now, when they did a huge exhibition of her work in New York at the MoMA museum. And in different rooms, different younger artists were recapturing her old works. You could just see what was happening. But in one room, nothing else was happening, that she was just sitting in a chair, and thousands of people were queuing to get a chance to sit across her for 2 or 3 minutes, silently. She would just sit, and the person would come and sit down, and they would look her in the eyes. They were just looking her in the eyes. And people said, some of them, there's a beautiful documentary about this when they were interviewing people. They said that this was one of the most transformative moments of their lives, to see and look in the eyes of total presence. Somebody who was totally present and projecting nothing of their own. Taking in completely the person who was opposite them. That is so freakishly rare. So she was the Olympic athlete, but all of us can get better at presence. Like, this is what I'm advocating for. In the storytelling in the age of AI cannot just be, we do a writer's room session when we all just jab and jab and jab and jab. That time is over, because AI is doing all type of thinking better. So what other aspects of creative process can we take into story development to make us come with fresh stuff, to make us come up with original things? I talked about Camus, and it may have sounded as if I was dissing him, but I wasn't, right? I love Camus. So, to go back to him, many years later in his life, like 20 years after he wrote The Stranger, he was back at the landscape where he grew up, and he wrote a beautiful essay called Return to Tipasa. It's very well known. And he was still at the height of his novelistic capacity. He was still a brilliant writer, but what he expressed there was very different than what he expressed in The Stranger. This is what he discovered. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lie an invisible summer. Late in his 40s, I think for the first time in his life, he experienced what happened to me, that toilet. It's never late. It can happen to anybody. And then a brilliant writer will be able to express even that and put it in a story. Wouldn't it be amazing if the guys who wrote Succession had some of that and then complemented that story with whatever is healthy, healing, reconnective? That story is myopic. It's brilliant and myopic. So, this kind of being with a dance of light and dark, fully feeling life totally, not like collapsing, not getting depressed, that's the best thing for all of us. It's a win-win. And people who can do this better than others, I think if all things being equal, you have a great writer who can dance the dance and a great writer who is in their head and protected. Who do you think will be more interesting as a storyteller in the age of AI? Yeah. So I had a wonderful teacher who liked to remind me whenever I got very sure of myself in some theory about what's going on. He would say, whenever you think you know what's going on, there's more to it. We can feel way more than we can think about any type of situation. Like there's more going on. We think there is war, we think there is violence, and at the same moment, the most beautiful situation happens with that umbrella. I mean, the beauty of that moment, the beauty of that woman. And I'm really wondering why not more storytellers are interested in people like that. Why there are not stories about how do you become that? Because emotionally stunted assholes have been told about endlessly, like enough. How do you become that? Do you think there's no drama in her life? And yet she was able to do that. Brilliant. So, to sum it up, to remain relevant in storyteller at the age where we have technology that can absolutely supplant the usual output, creative output, we really have to look at our own creative limitations and not take it as a personal deficiency, because this is not about us not being intelligent, being lazy, being untalented. It's about the time we live in. We really have to fight back for some quiet space, for some reconnection, for seeing the chicken, and it's up to us to fight for that, because everything that happens in the society will be pushing more content on us all the time. Advice I give to myself and everybody else: surround yourself with window cleaning ninjas. People in your lives, really choose your friends, people who can tell you, I'm going to tell you something you don't want to hear, and they tell you with love and you hear it. Edgy conversations, edgy people, we all need them. Whatever we get to do so that we drop that suit of protection, suit of numbness. For artists, hugely important. The nakedness is necessary, but nakedness that leads to resilience, not weakness. We can be naked and sensitive and resilient. And then always, always, always looking to be the people that can see the chicken our whole lives, not just when we were kids, that we die 100 years old and we can still see the chicken. Wouldn't that be a life? So these are some suggestions I'm like the result of my deep thinking about what's necessary in the future story development and creativity in the age of AI. To get away from the become more interested in resilience than trauma. There are so many stories about trauma out there. Very few of them say something about what the cure is. Trauma is a fact of life. Resilience is also a fact of life, but it's rarely explored parallelly with trauma. Instead, we have trauma and coping mechanisms. Somebody is an alcoholic, somebody uses sex to control people. All of these things have been told a gazillion times. I give you an example with a woman with an umbrella. That's resilience. Become fascinated with resilience as a phenomenon. You'll find incredible life stories with real people to inspire you. The unstoried space is a space of great inspiration. It helps you relax in life, accept whatever comes, because there is a bigger reality that you lean against. Become interested more in healing, whatever heals us, than whatever hurts us. So stories about dysfunction have been told many, many times. state the dysfunction and then tell us something about the cure as well. Because series are potentially symphonies. There is room for both, right? Train presence, I don't know what else could help us. Become interested in how we build communities, what my grandparents did. They had the same people beholden to each other, healing each other. How do we discover these things again? All of this, we have how do we live through our bodies? It's so difficult. How do we hold cognitively, emotionally paradoxes inside us? So difficult. So in order to tell good stories about any of these things, we have to experience them in life and explore them, because there is nothing that conventional wisdom will tell us about this. It's new territory. This is new territory. So I guess I'm calling this talk Rediscovering Life. There is so much there to rediscover if we just drop the idea that we may be the most evolved generation so far. What if we've just lost a lot of things that people knew how to do? How do we rediscover them? How do we integrate them in modern life? There's so much there to just find again. I'm a great proponent of something I like to call the real imagination. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it isn't. Real imagination is rooted in somebody's very rich lived experience of reality. Because reality is way more interesting than any story. And the tragedy is that oftentimes we feel that stories are more interesting than life. But when we live in a way that fascinates us with life, when we are fascinated with life, our imagination is rooted, it's strong, and we get to play. So instead of creating realistic stories, we create stories that are true to life in new, fresh forms. So I would say the storytellers of the future, first and foremost, need to be experiencers in life. We need to experience more than just watch a lot of stories and read a lot of stories. Explorers are always sexier than explainers. Just across the board. When you can always tell when somebody's exploring something through the story. Not just cognitively, but you know that in life they've been exploring this, and then the story is reflecting that. Even though if you put the story on the space shuttle 300 years from now, or in a period drama, somebody's actively exploring something they don't have a full grasp on because it's bigger than what they understand. That's a great writer. So, first experiencer, then explorer, then storyteller. It really is that in that order, I think. So, if I could leave you with just one thing about storytelling in the age of AI, I think more than anything else, we need to live to tell the tale. So thank you for listening. Thank you.